Welcome to Cross Checking. Today we answer the question, what does it look like when everything changes around you when you've done something well for a long time? The answer, surprisingly, is not just the 24-25 Nashville Predators.
I hate you so much.
This is how you know we don't actually run these cold opens by each other before we say anything.
I never would have signed off on such. First of all, you're wrong. First, we have not done anything super well for a long time. We've been mediocre for a long time. Now we're just bad instead of anyway. Welcome to Cross Checking. This is season 7, episode 4. I'm one of your hosts, Josh Laborious. I'm a pastor in Friendswood, Texas, down by Houston. As always, with my scruffy-looking co-host, Benjamin Olschlager from Lake Orion, Michigan, near Detroit. And I hope it's really cold there right now. And I hope you're not enjoying it, because you made fun of my hockey team.
It is kind of cold. I'm enjoying it some because I like the cold weather. Yeah, that's what you get. Sorry, Josh. But this topic, I think, is kind of fitting for my congregation to some extent, because Lake Orion, where Good Shepherd sits, was largely rural until the last 20, 30 years. There were some subs that were built a little earlier than that, but a lot has changed. I sat down with can't remember if she's 93 now or soon to be 93 year old member of the congregation who moved up to Lake Orion, to quote her, because we wanted something country. Now the suburb is not country. It's a suburb. There's not much like open land left in the township. That means that the community around the church has changed. Found out like within the last 25 years, there used to be cows that occupied the land just north of the church. Now there are just houses. So what does it look like for this community to respond to that change is kind of something that's constantly on my mind. And that's something that I think a lot of churches should be thinking about is, what does the world around us look like and how are we responding to that? The reason I made fun of the Preds is because they've played hard physical hockey for the last 5-6 years, had some level of success doing so, and then they brought in a bunch of flashy skill players to try and play with their like hard-nosed lineup, and you get this year's Predators.
Okay, well, hold on. This is not what the podcast is about, but I have to speak some defense to that. We made the change from the hard nose, we're just going to beat you to death, with Barry Trotz, who is this is his second season as general manager, and the new coach, Austin Burnett, who is very much Andrew Burnett. I knew a guy in high school named Austin. He coaches. It's not necessarily a high skill. I mean, it's higher skill than what John Hines coaches, but he's very much high speed and the high skill that is associated with that. So it's a transition we're intentionally trying to make, except for the fourth line, which we're satisfied with them being more the bruiser type. But like, it's an intentional shift.
I'll believe it when I see it.
So we didn't just sign these players and say, "Oh, we're going to make you play hard nose." We did sign some older players and say we want you to be fast, and that might be a problem.
Anyway, times have changed in many ways. So today we want to talk about what it will look like or what it should look like faithfully for a church to kind of respond to the changing demographics around it. And I think we didn't also talk about this either, but I think maybe two things to talk about to kind of guide our conversation today. One, how do you know that the world around you is shifting? Like, how do you know when you need to start to make changes? And two, what do you do if you've gone a long time without making changes and now you're trying to get caught up? Because the reality is, hopefully, Josh agrees with me on this, that if the world around you changes, it shouldn't change the the center of your message, but it will change the way in which you bring that message to the world.
Yeah. Well, it also changes how you present it, but it also might change what part of your message. Because we have as Christians and as Lutheran Christians as well, we have a multivalent message. We have a message that it's not just a single thing. Like, there are different elements of it, there are different aspects of it, and sometimes different people need focus given to those different aspects. Right? A younger person might have more questions about, so what, as I'm developing, as I'm maturing, as I'm stepping further and further into life, you might have more questions about, okay, so what's the application of this, or how do I live this out faithfully, right? And if you're more mature, you might say, you maybe still need a little of that, but you're like, I have a lot of those questions that I've gotten answered already, and your question might be more in line with, or you might find more need, I guess, for the message of hope, the message of reassurance for times when life gets tough and stuff like that. So there's a lot of reality to it's the same message, but Ben's exactly right. The presentation might have to shift, or the focus within that message might have to change. Okay. And you can do that and remain faithful. Now, to be fair, you can also try to do some of that and stray from where you need to be. Because and this is something I'm a big proponent of, when you are changing things, you don't just make changes for the sake of making changes. Know why you're doing it, and always keep an eye on the message underneath it. Because you wouldn't want to make changes, and in the process of making changes, you accidentally leave behind something that was very important, right? And maybe before we get too much further, I want to speak, and if this is too much of a rabbit hole, Ben can drag me out kicking and screaming.
I'll send you down with a tether.
Yeah, you can put me in the sin bin for a couple minutes.
There we go.
There's some, I guess, call it a quantitative reality to why it's so hard for us to change. Okay. And it has, as churches, I'm specifically talking as churches. As people, a lot of it comes down to how hard-nosed are you? Anyway, moving on from that, as churches, because it's a fascinating phenomenon. And the way I'm going to describe it, there are other things people call it, but I'm going to describe it based on the books that I've read about it. It's something called cultural or organizational culture. And what's fascinating about organizational culture is that it is greater than the sum of its parts. Because a lot of times when you think about an organization, you're like, okay, it's just a bunch of people, but it's more than that. It's, well, what's the history of the organization? What are the artifacts of the organization? And what is interesting is, in most cases, this is how organizational, cultural, and cultural DNA get built up, is we faced a crisis of some sort, and we did something to address that crisis or that problem, and it worked. So now that is part of our cultural DNA, because in our brains we say, okay, this works. When we approach problems like this solution works, and it becomes part of the DNA, and it gets built, and it gets built, and eventually you have this just amalgamation of a cultural organizational DNA. And it's not a bad thing. In fact, it's a good thing in many, many cases, but it's built over time. And then what happens is, when you face problems, the tendency is to say, okay, here's how we faced them before and it worked, so we're going to do that again. But that fails to take into account is you never face the same problem twice. Or I shouldn't say that. You very rarely face the same problem on an organizational level twice. And now you might say, well, that's not true. We faced declining membership before, and here's how we addressed it, and we're facing declining membership again. And I'm like, the way you've described it, yes, same problem, not the same problem.
Yeah,
because
what's the real problem and what's the symptom?
You faced declining membership for X, Y, and Z reasons, and now you're facing declining membership for A, B, and C reasons. It's not the same problem, even if it has the same, you can describe it on from a bird's eye view in the same way. And the reason I bring all this up is, when we are facing change, sometimes we have to adjust our cultural DNA because we have to contend with this reality. And it's hard to admit, it's hard to contend with, that what we have always done won't necessarily continue to work. And this is for those of you who are rah on the change train, something I have to tell you is don't expect sweeping overnight change for anything, for any organization, because here's the number. They say if you have someone at the helm who knows what they're doing, this is not just a leader. This is someone who knows what they're doing, who knows enough to recognize cultural DNA and then to intentionally start to shift it as necessary. So you have someone who knows what's up 5 to 10 years. If you have someone who is learning as they go, it's longer. If you have someone who is ignorant and just kind of going at it, could be even longer, could also just never happen. Okay? So if you're facing organizational change, keep in mind it's not a quick thing. Which for some of you might be uncomfortable with change, and that's a good thing for you to hear. You're like, okay, so we're not going to change everything overnight because it doesn't work. Change is necessary. It is important to do it the right way, to do it well, and to take your time to make sure it's actually doing what you want it to do. So as we're having the rest of this conversation, that is something to keep in mind. That no matter what routes you go, it's not a quick thing.
Also worth noting, if you need to change your carpet because it's moldy, that is not something that should take 5 years.
No, that's not a cultural DNA. That's an artifact. That's not the sum of your DNA. And if it's mold, that's a health problem.
Fix that sooner. Yeah.
Fix that sooner.
I think
so, Ben, where do you want to go next?
I think let's start by just asking the question, how do we know that we need to change? Because I think that's a hard place for people to start. And it's often one that miss the initial indicators and really only respond to when we hit lagging indicators on that kind of thing, right? Like in a lot of American churches, peak attendance in those churches was in the 1980s after we programatized a lot of evangelism. But the thing that led to peak church attendance was a system of much more kind of grassroots, door-to-door style evangelism that happened in the 20s, 30s, 40s that meant a generation later, those people's kids were kind of hitting the church and figuring out what was going on. And that kind of died out, I think it was in the 40s, either the 30s or the 40s. The LCMS planted a church every week, I think.
Yeah, I've heard that statistic before. I never ask it because it's never the place to ask, but my follow-up question is always, okay, you were planting a church every week, but how many of them survived?
A lot of them.
Okay, there you go. But that's my curiosity, because
just go around to
people are really excited about starting new ministries, and it's it's not just the start that matters. It's have you built something sustainable?
True. But if you go to a lot of suburban churches in the United States and you look at Cornerstone dates, just look at how many of them were started in the 40s, 50s, and 60s.
This Hope would be one of them. So
Good Shepherd was started in 72, just kind of at the tail end of all of that. Also very much one of them. But the point I was getting at, the thing that made people start to think, oh, the church is losing prominence come these early 2000s, that kind of thing, was 80s, 90s, early 2000s, was decline in attendance. The church saw its first real decline in attendance around those times. And I don't think that was really the first indicator. I think the indicator that said, hey, maybe we're slipping somewhere was, 20 years earlier, when there were a lot of, contentious issues in the church that were causing significant conflict, and denominations were splitting left, right, and center. Church membership was plateauing, and seminary enrollment was decreasing, and there were all of these other indicators that said, hey, maybe something is going south with the church and we need to fix this. Parts of it got addressed and remedied, but not everything did. So what does that look like on a congregational level?
Yeah. Well, and for what it's worth, this is not our conversation today. Well, maybe it's part of our conversation today. It's not part of the topic before us, which is identifying when change is necessary. But I think Ben has identified the first step of when you think change is necessary, how do you do that? Because the first step is, well, let's figure out exactly what the actual issue is instead of the issue that has made us aware that change is necessary.
I'm also kind of trying to get at the point that, like, when you get to the point where you think change is necessary, I think in a lot of cases, change was actually necessary 5, 10, 15, 20 years prior, and we just missed some of the signs.
Yeah.
So just because things are going well doesn't necessarily mean that, like, everything is actually functioning the way it should.
So I think, to your point, from a church perspective, when do you know change is necessary? And this might be oversimplifying it, so maybe Ben can bring us some nuance, which is a wild thing for me to say. But I think change is necessary when the church isn't fulfilling its mission.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mean whatever, and some of them are good, some of them are bad. I don't mean like the mission that your church at some point has settled on, for the tagline you put under your name. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Some of those are good, some of them are bad. We're not here to talk about those. I mean the Great Commission. If the church is not making disciples, or it's not effectively making disciples, or we are not worshiping people, we're not reaching people with the gospel, like when that stuff is failing, what is not a sign of change, that you need change, is just because numbers are dropping. I think I was interviewing with a church, and this term came up, and I actually really like it, so I'm going to stick with it. We have, in some places, we have an idolatry of numbers.
Mm-hmm.
Because what's important? Well, our membership, our attendance, our offering numbers. Now, are those numbers important? To a certain extent. Why are they important? I think they're important because they do tell a little bit of a story about the actual mission.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have 600 members, but your regular worship attendance is 30 people, I'm not concerned because attendance is low. I'm concerned because that means discipleship is not where it should be, because worship isn't a priority.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, or if your giving numbers are down, I'm not concerned because the church isn't making as much money. I'm concerned because giving is an element of our discipleship. And if giving is down, I'm inclined to say, well, are we failing to make disciples, or is there another reason behind it? Okay. So I think it's as simple as that. Do you need to change? Well, are you discipling people as well as you could be? And I don't know where we draw the line between, are we changing or are we just refining ourselves? Because like if you could always be doing stuff better. So if you're just adjusting things to make your discipleship better or your evangelism better, I don't know when we change that from we're refining something to we're changing something. So I don't know where that line is. I'm sure it's there somewhere. When people get upset, that's when we call it change instead of refinement.
There's probably more truth in that than we want to admit.
There's almost certainly more to it than that. But I'm willing to simplify it that far and say change is necessary when we are no longer fulfilling the mission God has given us.
Yep. The tricky part is how do you know? So this is a personal thing, but there's a study that, I can't remember when it came out, I think about 15 years ago, that kind of looked at the life cycle of churches and discovered that about every 7 to 10 years, churches need to make some sort of, whether you want to call it reorganizational effort or, mission shift or, pick your buzzwords, right? But the churches that most healthily kind of work through and respond to change kind of naturally do it every 7 to 10 years. And that could be an introspective process, that could be staff turnover, that could be whatever you want it to be.
Well, and I think, I don't mean to cut you off, but I'm going to lose my train of thought if I don't.
Sure, go ahead.
I think part of that is because you're practicing change and changing, in the 7 to 10 year range, what that does for you is it keeps you from getting in a rut. Because if you're kind of used to, well, every once in a while we shake things up a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
When you need to change, it's not a huge deal because you are used to it on some level at least.
Mm-hmm. And I think part of the impetus behind it is that we often kind of start something with one particular outcome in mind. So maybe that's you change the style of your worship so that it becomes more tailored towards the demographics of your neighborhood that are less Christian uh, than most places in your area or whatever. So not that you're like stripping away stuff that's necessary, but just like you maybe come at your worship with a more catechetical approach where you're trying to teach people as you go, where you may not do that in a place where you know that Christianity is more established in the neighborhood. And for 7 years, that's a great approach. But after 7 years, like if you've gotten new people in the door who are like, yeah, we get the basics.
We got that part.
Let's move on. Talks I think it's to Timothy about like, no, he talks to Timothy about drinking the milk when you need it. Paul's mad at somebody and he tells them to stop drinking milk and start eating meat. Yep. Josh, you can find the reference if you're really bored.
I'll give you a Google. I want to say I'm gonna look it up before I say something wrong.
Yeah. Anyway, but that's like if that's what your congregation needs, if they need to stop drinking milk and start eating meat.
Hebrews.
What?
So maybe.
Okay, so maybe Paul in Hebrews. Yeah, like that might be what your change needs to be. And if you don't make that change and you don't start to challenge your people with new aspects of the faith that they haven't, come at as much in the last 7 years, well, things are going to stagnate and you're going to miss something. Like it's why we use, at least in the LCMS, it's why the majority of churches use a lectionary so that we don't get stuck on one set of topics and we shift around on things. It's why your diet is supposed to be varied so that you're getting vitamins and minerals and calories and all of the things that your body needs to function. You need that kind of variety and change. And when churches are trying to target problems in their community with the way that they approach things, that's good. But then you also kind of need to put something of an end date on it so that you know when you need to shift into the next phase of whatever you're doing. So I think that's another piece of like, when do you start to do this? Well, just do it periodically so that you recognize when that needs to happen.
And I hope this doesn't come across as self-aggrandizing. This is something hopefully you can trust your leaders, your pastors especially, but also the lay leaders in your congregation to lead in. Mm-hmm. Because it's something you want someone who is as situationally aware as possible to kind of lead or pump the brakes on stuff like that as much as possible. Because the reality, and I'll say it now for everybody, for the people in the back to hear, okay, here's the reality. In your world, in your interaction with the church, you may see something that's like a glaring issue that needs to be fixed as soon as possible. Mm-hmm. But here's the thing. Your pastor, if he's good at his job, is not just talking to you. He's talking to everyone throughout the congregation. And while for you it might be a major issue, for someone who sits on the other side of the church, it might be something that they need for now. Mm-hmm. Or it might be something, or there might be another problem that is more pressing. So it is worth keeping in mind that at some point, you hopefully can trust your leaders to recognize when change is necessary or when it needs to not happen for a little bit. Mm-hmm. Because the reality, and again, like, don't hear me, this is not me diminishing any of the other rules of the congregation. But in many congregations, the pastor gets to hear things that no one else gets to hear. Mm-hmm. Because there are some things that people will share with the pastor that they will not share with anyone else. So if you're looking for someone who is situationally aware, the pastor in and there are some pastors who are clueless. I get that. And there are also some congregations where the pastor isn't the go-to. I understand that as well. I'm just saying, in a lot of contexts, the pastor is probably going to be your best bet at organizational situational awareness.
Yeah. And if it's not the pastor, or even maybe perhaps in a lot of cases, in addition to the pastor, you want to loop in, whether you've got a board of spiritual care or a board of elders or whatever that looks like,
Because there are also things that people will share with an elder that they won't talk to their pastor about.
Yep.
For a variety of reasons.
Yep. Those are good. Those are good people to have involved. People who are active.
Your youth people are going to have a pulse on the kids that a pastor might not.
Yep. And don't neglect the, patriarchs and matriarchs of the church either. The people who've just been there, done that forever.
Who have heard all the whispers.
And they know where all the bodies are buried. Those people are good to have in on conversations like that. Yeah. Because, the wisdom there is incredible, and just the
awareness of landmines.
Yeah. The organizational knowledge is hard to replace. So don't neglect those people. So once you've got your team assembled and you kind of have this rhythm of being reflective of the church, then you're looking for the things that Josh was talking about, the Great Commission stuff. And I think you can kind of apply that on down the line, right? Are you in the habit of going? Do you just all come together for worship, or do you spend time not just in the building, but in the community being the church? Are you in the habit of making disciples? Are you trying to grow in your faith? Or are you there just for numbers? Are you baptizing? If your church hasn't done a baptism in years, 1, dust the font, that's gross. And 2,
you might want to ask why.
Yeah, exactly. Are you teaching? Are you working in the Word? Are you trying to grow in your understanding of how the faith works?
Are you a community?
Yeah.
Or it's the only time you see each other on Sunday morning?
Yeah. And do you understand that God is present in your life? I think if you kind of cycle through those things, and if the answer to any of those questions is no, and if the people are being honest and the answer to any of those questions is no, then you know where you need to start to make changes. And that's obviously easier to do when you do this more regularly, but churches are churches and they tend to take time to do things.
Yes, they do. Which is good. It is good in that it helps us from making rash decisions. It can also be frustrating in that when you need to make a decision, sometimes it takes longer than you think it should.
Yes, yeah. So next thing I want to jump into, Josh, and if you're not ready to jump here yet, feel free to back me up.
Lead away.
All right. So if you are a congregation that you missed some of the leading indicators and now the lagging indicators are catching up and telling you, hey, we're not meeting the needs of our changing demographics around this church. Again, those could be like cultural, those could be societal, those could be racial, those could be economical, those could be all sorts of things, right? If we're not meeting those and we're like way behind the times, how do we play catch up? And Josh, I'm going to toss it back to you here.
Was that because I have a hot take on this?
Your face told me that was the truth, yes.
Okay. So I have 2 responses to this. And no, I have 3 comments. And
I'm going to hold you to 3. If you say you've got 4, then I'm going to make you stop.
3 is good.
Okay. Folks, I think he's writing notes because
I'm writing down so I don't forget where I'm going with this.
This might be the 3rd time in show history we have written notes in the podcast. One of those was not from us.
Yeah. Okay, so the first thing that I think when you realize you're behind the ball and you have to change is to take an honest stock of the situation, right? And we talked about that already a little bit. Drill down, figure out what the actual problem is, okay? And then the follow-up is you realize you're behind the ball. And when we realize we're behind the ball, the tendency is, okay, we gotta go, we gotta catch up, we gotta speed up.
Mm-hmm.
Hold on. Because I think there's an unfortunate reality that when you speed through something, occasionally you get lucky and it works out. But a lot of times we think of a quick solution that sounds good, but we don't really drill down to think if it's going to fix the actual problem or if it's going to fix any problem, and we just go for it. And then at the end, we're like, well, that didn't work out. And unfortunately, that then feeds into we tried something new and it didn't work, so we should just keep doing what we've been doing this whole time. Okay?
Yeah.
So make sure that the solution you are going to put into action actually solves the problem. For example, and this is a spicy example, and I'm going to get even spicier with my second point. Okay, a felt problem in many churches across America is we don't see the young people anymore. Right? I'm sure you've heard that, Ben. I've heard that before. And
Just a
if
couple
you're listening
times.
to this and you are in a congregation, I'm sure you've heard or said that before. And a lot of times we say, okay, we have a problem. We do have a problem. We don't have young people. Like we're missing age group, or we're missing a generation, and they need to be discipled. They need to be reached out to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You have accurately diagnosed a problem. I would agree with you. This is an issue. We need to deal with it. But we immediately, and I've heard this more times than I care to admit, our solution is, well, we need to modernize our worship. And we need hip young music, and we need a contemporary service, because that's going to get the young kids in. You have accurately identified a problem. I would 9 times out of 10, you have not dived deep enough into what the actual problem is. Because it's not just young people aren't in church. Why aren't young people in church? Are young people not in church because they feel like it's not hip enough? I've never heard that from a young person I've talked to who's not in church. It's never, well, it's just too old and it sounds, no, it's because they don't find anything I've heard we don't find anything meaningful for us there. So maybe we need to speak more to issues that younger people are dealing with. I've heard, I don't feel like I'm connected to anyone there. So maybe we need to work on building relationships with young people and more focused on. So the issue isn't worship isn't hip enough. But that's an easy solution. That's like in sports. When a team isn't doing well, they fire the coach, even if it's not his fault, because that's like a good Band-Aid. It's like, see, we're doing something, and it seems like it could possibly be the problem. And I think contemporary worship sometimes for us is that, well, we need to modernize. It's like, have you talked? Is that really the complaint? Is that the issue? Or because frankly, that's an easy one. If the issue is, oh, we're not building relationships take time, relationships take work. If the issue is we don't have enough substance for the young people, like for where they're at, that takes more work to adjust. If the issue is, the church is clinging to things that really mattered, but they don't matter to me anymore, and every time I go, I'm getting pressured to do these things that I just don't care about because someone else was passionate about them. Like that's a really hard thing to do. Okay. So whenever you are facing change, make sure you have found the actual problem and that your solution is actually going to address it, not just make you feel good because you're doing some quote unquote something about the problem. Okay. So that's my first thing. And the second question I think we have to ask when we're looking at change and how do we do it is it time to give up? Mm-hmm. That's my spicier thing. That's my spicier point. I only remembered 2. So in the time it took me to pull out a Post-it note, I forgot one of my 3. And I don't mean give up on the mission. What I mean is to ask, are we as an organization capable of the change that needs to be made, or would we be better off planting something new? And the example I'll use is this. Okay, so I think this has happened to a lot of city churches especially, where at one point the church was very successful, it was flourishing, but then you had their demographic moved out to the suburbs, and sometimes they still commute, but eventually that gets to be a pain, and they find a church out in the suburbs. And then you have a new cultural demographic that moves in around the church. And my question is, and I can't tell you that I have an answer. I suspect I know what the answer might be, but I don't know. My question is, are we better off trying to pivot that ministry and say, we as a organization, we're going to change to fit this new demographic? Or would we be better off saying, we are going to move on and give up, and this would be the radical part of it, and give up our building in this space to start a new ministry that from the ground up is going to reach this new demographic where it's at. So say you're Trinity Lutheran Church. I don't know. This is just this is a church name that comes up a lot in Lutherans. Okay, you're Trinity Lutheran Church, and you've been in you've been in the city for 80 years and you look around and all of your members, they drive 30 minutes to get there. And all the people around you have never stepped foot in your doors. My question is it better to say we're going to change the identity of Trinity Lutheran Church, or do we say Trinity Lutheran Church, you get a new building? That's out where your people are. Or you let it go. You retire Trinity Lutheran Church. And then you plant New Beginnings Lutheran Church in the exact building that Trinity used to be. And it's a new church, and there are new leaders, and you treat it through and through as a mission. And I think that's true not just with churches as a whole, but also within churches. When you have something that's not working, when do we say we're going to retire this and start something new versus when do we try to change what exists? And I think that's an important evaluation for us to go through, because to be honest, like now that I've studied cultural DNA, and like I said, I don't know if this is the answer, but I suspect it is. I bet you would be a lot more successful if you said we're going to move Trinity and plant a new church where Trinity used to be. What do you think, Ben?
I think there's a lot of truth to both of those things, and especially to that second point. There's a statistic that says something to the effect of, like, I think it's like 2/3 of most church plants are made up of people who never had a church before. So it frequently amazes me when, people are interested in church planting that others in the area are not. Like, you don't even necessarily have to be fully bought in, but be supportive if there's a good reason to church plant, because it's more often than not largely reaching people who did not have a good church before, or who did not have a church period before. It typically benefits the congregations surrounding the plant too that are invested in that plant, because it helps them look outward as well. And if you think about the same thing on a local level, if your church has been doing something forever and it's just not working, try something new. Try something that you haven't done before and see if it reaches a new group of people that you haven't seen before. If the same people are coming to your thing every night or every Thursday night or whatever, try reaching a new group of people. Try something new. Not that we want to shun the people that have come to whatever you've got that's working, but don't neglect the one for the 99. I think the other piece of advice that I would tack on to those couple of things is, if you need to make substantial changes as a church, whether it's being honest about the changes that you need to make and then doing them well, or if it's just completely letting things start over from ground zero. In addition to those things, one of the best things that you could probably do is lean on somebody outside of you to help you see what's missing. It's one of those old school truisms that it's hard to recognize the changes in your own face, because you look at yourself in the mirror just about every morning when you get up. But if somebody hasn't seen you for 10 years, what's their first response?
Wow, you chopped off your man bun.
Exactly.
Well, that's not true. 10 years ago, I guess I'd get the reaction, wow, your hair's so long.
Yeah, there you go.
10 years ago, I had a buzz cut. 5 years ago, I had a man bun.
Yeah, so when you need something, when you need someone that is a little bit more objective about seeing the good, the bad, the ugly, getting an outside perspective is always helpful. And there are consulting firms that do that kind of thing for churches nowadays. I wouldn't even necessarily recommend that. If you're in the LCMS, go to your circuit visitor and ask them to come take a look at your church. Or if your district has mission execs, have them come take a look at your church. Or just, somebody that you trust. Maybe a former member of the congregation that moved away a while ago and will be objective. Bring him in, have him come take a look at it and see where you can grow and see where you can make changes for the better and for the better of the kingdom.
I think there's a lot of truth to that, having a more or less not objective third party, because you want someone who does care about the ministry that you're doing,
mm-hmm.
but someone who is removed from the specific organization can be, I think, really helpful.
Yep. You ready for tap-ins?
Empty net goals? I sure am. Would you like to go first, or shall I?
You can go first.
All right. I think my big takeaway is when you're talking about change in your church, take your time with it and make sure at every level that you are thinking through what you're doing and what conclusions you are basing that on. Like, just take your time and think through it so that when you do it, it is done well. What about you, Ben? What's your empty netter?
I think my big empty netter is honesty is key in this whole process. Whether you are in church leadership, you need to be honest about the things that you're looking at and the conclusions that you're drawing from them. And if you are on the congregational side looking at change that's happening, you need to be honest about why it may or may not be happening. Think, am I part of the reason that we need to make this change good or bad? Right? And respond to that. Don't just do what Lutherans are really good at doing and just complain.
Yeah, that's less helpful.
Yeah. So honesty is key in this whole process, and make sure that you're seeking truthful and honest answers to all the questions that are being asked, no matter what part of it you play.
Sounds good. All right, with that, this has been Season 7, Episode 4 of Cross-Checking. We're happy you guys are here. If you have questions or comments that you want to throw, you can toss them under the podcast. We have a YouTube page that you can also put them on. You can reach out to us as individuals. If this episode has been helpful to you and you think it would be helpful to someone else in your life, go ahead and send them a link. We love when you share. That's our primary means of sharing this podcast, is we just count on you guys. If you like it, you're going to share it with people you know who might also like it. We haven't spent a dime on advertising, and I don't think we're going to. So with like, subscribe, all the rest, we're happy you've been here. Brothers and sisters, go in peace. Serve the Lord.
Thanks be to God.